Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Mary Molly Mullaney. I'm the teacher's assistant for the School of Pastoral Ministry Zoom classes. And tonight we have our Sinners and Saints in Dante's Divine Comedy. And we're here with Dr. Anthony Nussmeier, our professor. And let's begin with a short prayer. Thank you, Lord, for bringing us together. Open our hearts and our minds to your words and intentions. Help us to draw closer to you through studying these classical works. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. In the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right. Thank you, Professor. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mary Molly, and thank you to all of our attendees and students for coming back for another bite after week one. It's great to be here. As I said earlier, anytime we can talk about Dante sort of warms my heart. And so hearing about the interest in Dante and the desire to know more about Dante really enkindles a greater love for learning even than I had before. So I'm happy to be an evangelist for Italian and be an evangelist for Dante tonight. Just like last week, I have a couple of prepared set pieces, but otherwise I'll just speak and for about 50 minutes or so, and hopefully leaving a good 20 to 30 minutes for some follow-up discussion and questions. I know not all of you were able to be here last week, so I wanted to begin by just recapping a little bit what we talked about last week, so that not everyone is in the dark. And let me see if I can succeed in sharing my screen here. So you should be able to see the PowerPoint in just a moment. And so I just wanted to run through what I see as some of the main themes that I touched on last Tuesday. The first is that, and this came up, some of these also just came up in the follow-up and discussion and points that I wanted to elaborate on here tonight. But the first is that Dante is the father of Italian. He's considered the father of Italian language, but he is not the inventor of Italian, nor is he the first Italian poet. And a question that I think was asked by Susan Hart, I responded by talking about the sort of different waves of Italian poetry. The first being Italian poets who didn't write in Italian. They wrote in Old Occitan and Provençal, the language of the troubadour poets from the south of France. The second wave of Italian poetry was the Sicilian poets, the so-called Scuola Siciliana, the Sicilian school at the court of Frederick II in about the third and fourth decades of the 13th century. Then we had a brief interlude where we have the Siccolo Toscani, who are poets in the northern Italian communes in Pisa, in Arezzo, in Florence, mainly in Tuscany, but also in Bologna. And then finally comes Dante. So again, Dante is not the inventor of Italian. He is not the first Italian poet, but he is the Italian who writes in Italian and who is the most successful with the Divine Comedy. I also talked a little bit about the historical context in which Dante wrote the Divine Comedy. He wrote it principally while in exile, and the backdrop of the composition of the comedy was an absolutely fractured and divisive, factious political background. You had the battle between the 14th century Jets and the Sharks, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. You had dozens of different states and duchies and kingdoms and principalities on Italian soil. And so what Dante sought above all else was unity. And as he writes in the letter to Cangrande, the goal of the Divine Comedy is to bring people to happiness, both on earth and to spiritual happiness. We also talked a little bit about the sort of reception of Dante in the 19th and 20th centuries, and how, again, this sort of paradox, both liberal Italy, that is the new Italian nation state, which came about only beginning in 1861, and the church tried to claim Dante. Liberal Italy was looking for something unifying a peninsula that we just heard was fractured and divided. While the church, of course, claims Dante sort of after the fact as the Catholic poet, the theological poet. Another paradox we talked about is that with all this divisiveness on the Italian peninsula, perhaps the one unifying sort of red thread in Italian history is its literature. And this begins with Dante, but also continues with Petrarch and Machiavelli and many others. And so there's a sort of literary unification, as I see it, that precedes and even supersedes its political unification. If you talk to Italians today, many identify themselves still by the small town from which they come or the region from which they come, rather than Italy itself. So the idea of Italy has always been fraught. We saw a few papal encyclicals, a motu proprio, and some other speeches. And principally, we saw that the church, both Pope Paul VI and Pope Benedict in 1921, the 15th, they call Dante ours. And this is despite Dante's willingness to condemn popes and other church in the church hierarchy to hell in the Divine Comedy, especially as we saw already a preview in Inferno 19 when he put the popes head down, pile driven into the earth. And this occurred also despite Dante's argument in the De Monarchia that the Pope ought to concentrate on being Christ's vicar on earth, his two sons argument. That is, there were two sons, the emperor and the Pope, and each had its proper sphere. Another theme that I introduced and that we'll expound on tonight is that the comedy itself presents a very unified cosmos consisting of death, love, and God. Death beginning in the Inferno, love engulfing the purgatory, and God, of course, encompassing paradise. And this sort of unified cosmos ends with God himself, the ultimate governor, who has bound the universe in a single volume, as Dante says later on in Paradise, and as he or someone else glosses in the letter to Can Grande. I also mentioned that it's important we understand that the Inferno is no synecdoche. It is not the part standing for the whole. And so we have to read on through Purgatory and Paradise. And we'll see already a little bit tonight. Our lesson tonight will concentrate on the beginning part of Inferno. And we're going to look at how sinners are described, how Dante describes hell, how Dante describes the shades of the Inferno. But then we'll also emphasize how we have to read beyond it to see how those sins and sinners and perversions are then corrected in the subsequent two canticles in Purgatory and Paradise. I also quoted from a portion of Pope Paul VI, 1965, motu proprio, in sort of relaying to you the inspiration for this course, where he describes the comedy, and I quote, as moving from the abyss of crimes punished through the serene realms where human spirits purify themselves toward the arduous summits of perfection, to which a multiplicity of ways lead to holiness and splendor. There are those who model the many different forms that holiness takes, panegyrics woven for St. Francis, St. Dominic, St. Peter Damian, St. Benedict of Norcia, St. Romuald, St. Bernard, all rising towards a summit, end quote. And so we'll begin tonight in just a moment with the abyss of crimes punished, that is with the Inferno. And I won't presume that we've all read the material for this evening, especially since you just got it today. I'll try to do my best to get that out even more quickly next time. But I'll sort of try to thread the needle between being too banal, too simplistic, and sort of too abstruse. And so I'll provide a brief introduction to the Inferno, and then we'll stop and consider Inferno 1, Inferno 2, Inferno 3, and probably, if we have time, Inferno 5. So for the first 5 canti of the Divine Comedy. And so what you have here on the screen is, in fact, the Divine Comedy. So what is it? What is it when we talk about the Divine Comedy? This is the earliest manuscript version. And if you recall, I believe in the follow-up question and answer period last week, I talked about the nature and the success of the Divine Comedy, that there exists today almost 880 manuscript copies, which is an enormous number, perhaps second only to the Bible, in this period of a text to have survived, 880 manuscripts. And so this is the earliest manuscript that we have. It's from 1335, and it's the Ashburnham 828. It's now held in Florence. It was probably copied in Florence or perhaps Pisa, but in any case, northern Italy and northern Tuscany. And the one significant thing about this is that it actually is 15 years, it was copied 15 years after Dante died. So when we talk about the Divine Comedy, it's difficult to talk about what Dante actually wrote because we have nothing in Dante's own hand and we have nothing from before he died. We have only copies transcribed by other people, the earliest of which is a decade and a half after his death in 1321. So it's another one of those paradoxes in which things are not quite as they seem when we're talking about Italian literature, Italian history, and even Dante himself. And so let's jump into it a little bit tonight. Dante, as we heard last week, finished his epic, The Comedy, now called the Divine Comedy, in 1321, if we're to believe Giovanni Boccaccio, right before his death. He was exiled from his beloved Florence, and he died in the city of Ravenna, as we also heard. So successful was this epic poem that within just 3 decades of his death, it had become proverbial in Italy to say, when speaking of something universally known, oh, that's Il Libro di Dante, Dante's book. The way we might say today, well, that's way to go, Captain Obvious, or everybody knows that, right? Well, that's Dante's book. And as I mentioned, we have today almost 880 extant manuscripts of this poem, an extraordinary number given the homicide rate of medieval manuscripts. But again, what did it mean to read Dante to his medieval contemporaries? I think I mentioned last week that we view Dante as capital C culture, high culture, right? It's akin to going to the opera, even if the beginnings of opera and the continuance of opera in the 19th century in Italy was not necessarily high culture either. Now we think of it as going with your stuffed shirt, your tuxedo to listen to people singing. And we think the same way or in a similar way about the Divine Comedy, but in essence, what they were reading was sort of popular culture, or at least a record that reflected actuality, that reflected current events. So current were the historical references in the poem that Dante updated them as he went along. Thus, his treatment of personages and families and politicians and rulers differs in Purgatory with respect to Inferno. For example, in Inferno, he might say something negative about the Della Scala family in Verona, only to change his mind later on. So popular was the poem, and I really want to emphasize this, how much of a success it was. That's why Dante is the father of Italian. So popular was it in the sense that it was read by the popular class, not just the nobles of the elite, but merchants and others, that we have apocryphal stories about the poem's oral circulation. A couple of my favorites, and these are, I think back to the scandal in 2004 involving Dan Rather and certain National Guard documents involving a former president, and they were considered fake but accurate documents. These apocryphal stories about Dante are fake but accurate because both of these anecdotes involve him returning to Florence. And as I mentioned last week, we know that in 1302, he was banished from Florence, exiled. And in 1304, he was exiled upon punishment of death if he were to ever return. So he never returned to Florence, but a couple of my favorite anecdotes that speak to the popularity, again, among the popular classes and not just clergy or nobles, take place in Florence. One of them involves Dante walking down the streets of Florence and seeing a blacksmith work. And the blacksmith is, I don't know, shoeing a horse or something. And as he's doing it, he's reciting aloud Dante's Comedy, and he's doing it poorly. And Dante comes up and he hits him on the back of the head and he says, "Hey, I don't ruin your art. Don't ruin mine," right? In another anecdote, similarly, that takes place in Florence, there's a rag seller or a mule driver walking through the streets of Florence. And he too, like the blacksmith, is reciting aloud the Divine Comedy. He's like, nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita, mi ritrovai per una selva oscura. Arr! And he's kind of whipping the mule and saying, arr, in between the verses. And Dante comes up and he hits him on the back of the shoulders and he says, I didn't put those R's in the poem, and neither should you. The point is, number one, that Dante was very protective of his poem, that which he had written. And we know this because he went to great lengths to protect it, right? He ends every canticle, Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradise, with the word stelle or stella. He uses terza rima, which we'll see in just a moment, as also as a way of protecting his text. But it also tells us that we were still astride two ways of circulating culture in this period, both oral and written. And not only that, it also tells us that there was a sort of reception and transmission of the Divine Comedy that transcended professions and classes, and was read by clergy, and was read by merchants, and was read by noblemen and women, but also read by those who were just plying a trade. And so it's not just capital C culture, at least it was not during Dante's time, at least not only. So anyway, back to the question of what does it mean to read Dante and his epic, now qualified as divine, in the 21st century, a poem written by a man who lived some 700 years ago, and who, as I also said last week, shares very few, if any, of our modern sensibilities on subjects such as economics, politics, and sex. I would venture that we read it because it is unsurpassingly beautiful, good, and true. But the reality is, in our secular or even post-secular age, even that is verboten to say. If many readers were honest, they would admit that they enjoyed the depiction of sins and punishments in the Inferno, the first canticle of the poem. After all, the contrapassi, the punishments devised by Dante to mirror the sins committed, are often fascinating. For example, the soothsayers, those who presumed and claimed to be able to see into the future, have their heads sewn on backwards in the Divine Comedy. That's their punishment. And so Dante usually gives you a punishment that fits the crime, that fits the sin. A related question, and one that I posed in part also last week, is what does it mean to read Dante's comedy as a Catholic? And do Catholic readers have a special duty with regard to the poem? After all, Dante called his poem in Paradise 25 the poem to which that has had both a sort of sacred or heavenly, divine, and earthly influence, calling it a poema sacro, a sacred poem. So the answer to the question, do Catholics have a special duty and why read Dante in the 21st century, is not an easy one to answer. The one regarding Catholics ought to be an easier one. The comedy is a political text, but not in the modern sense. That view of politics is too circumscribed. It's too narrow. In Dante, politics is a philosophical idea rooted in Aristotelian thought. Man as civic animal in pursuit of happiness, a pursuit present throughout not only the comedy, but also in his Convivio and even in his De Vulgari Eloquentia, where he argues that language, especially vernacular language, is a sort of centripetal force rooted in place, grounded in the city. Dante has a message expressed in that letter to Cangrande, the letter he wrote, or at least a part of which he wrote, to his future patron in Verona. And that message is universal, both Catholic with a capital C and a lowercase c, I think, to bring people from happiness, unhappiness to happiness. And again, in that letter, at least part of which was written by Dante, we find the following descriptions of his comedy, and I quote, "We can say briefly that the purpose of the whole, as well as the part, is to remove those living in this life from a state of misery and to lead them to a state of happiness." The description of the poem's immediate purpose is one paralleled by Dante the Pilgrim poet's own journey from the discord and division of the Inferno, a place that he'll describe as mute of all light, full of wailing and screaming and gnashing of teeth, to the overwhelming polyphonic unity of the final canticle, Paradise, or is he instead guided by light that is divine and overabundant, and by the sweet sounds of the Psalms and by music? If the essential truth of Catholicism is that we believe that Jesus became man, died, and was resurrected, and as a corollary that it is the goal of all Catholics to get to heaven, then the most faithful Catholic reading of Dante's epic poem must go beyond the Inferno and consider Dante the pilgrim poet's trip through purgatory and finally up the ascent to the heights of paradise. The message asks us, requires us to read the whole of the poem and not just its part or parts. So, what do we mean by the parts of the poem? And here I wanted to go into something that, for those of you who have read the Commedia, might be a bit of a review, but I think it's important to think about what we're talking about here with regard to the structure of the poem. And so I have a couple of things prepared to just talk about here. We already talked about the background, the political, cultural, historical milieu of the composition of the Divine Comedy. Dante's in exile, he's seeking patrons, he's seeking libraries, he's seeking sheepskin and pens with which to write. He has nothing, right? He is a penniless pilgrim. He sets the Divine Comedy then in the Jubilee year of 1300, either on March 25th or April 8th. The March 25th is the most likely date and around which there's been built a consensus because the March 25th was actually the beginning of the new year in Florence because it was the celebration of the Annunciation. Obviously, it's 9 months out from Christmas. And so corresponding to the new life of Christ, March 25th was actually the beginning of the year. And so Dante probably began his journey in the Divine Comedy around March 25th, the Jubilee year of 1300. I mentioned in the beginning last week in the context of Inferno 19, when we discussed very briefly Dante's inclusion of Boniface VIII in the Divine Comedy. He got around the problem of Boniface not being dead yet in 1300 by having a case of mistaken identity occur later on in the circle where the simoniacs are being punished. So with the Divine Comedy, we have the Jubilee year of 1300. Dante, the character, begins his journey March 25th. The language in which it's written, as we mentioned last week in the follow-up, is really, it's Italian, but it's really Dante's own dialect, that is Florentine, Tuscan Italian. He includes in that many neologisms, words he invents himself, Provençalisms, words he borrows from the troubadour legacy, Frenchisms, Spanishisms, Arabicisms, and other things. But the language is Italian. The structure of the Divine Comedy is divided into 3 canticles, Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradise, each composed of 33 canti, except for the Inferno, which has what is considered to be a prologue or introductory canto, and we'll discuss it in just a few minutes. But you can see already the number 33, the number 3. Medieval minds were very much into numerology, and Dante was no exception. The number of the Trinity, 3 times 3, all of these were very important. There exist in the Divine Comedy 14,233 verses, almost all of which, except for a couple of couplets at the end of a few canti, are in terzine, or stanzas of 3 verses. And Dante, within these terzine, uses what is called terza rima. Terza rima means that the second verse of each tercet provides the rhyme word for the first and third verses of the next terzina. And so this was another way of protecting his text, but it also sort of sends the reader ahead, propels the reader ahead in a really wonderful, almost stream of consciousness way. What is the meter of Dante's Italian? Dante's Italian here, as most Italian poetry is in this period, is written with endecasyllabi, that is the hendecasyllable. This basically means that the final stress is on the 10th syllable of each verse, which is usually the second to last syllable. So there are usually 11 syllables in a verse, and the final stress will be on the 10th. And there'll be additional stresses on either the 4th or the 6th, typically. So, oops. Excuse me, this collapsed on me. All right, we're back. So we'll just edit that out. There are a couple of examples of what an endecasyllable is. Here we have an example from a predecessor hailing from Bologna, Guido Guinizelli. This is the first verse in his poem, Al cor gentil rempaira sempre amore. And you can see there are 11 syllables, and the emphasis, the final stress, is on the 10th syllable, the second to last. Similarly, these are the first two verses of Dante's Divine Comedy, Inferno 1:1 and Inferno 1:2. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita. The last stress is on the 10th syllable, the second to last. Mi ritrovai per una selva oscura. Again, here, the final stress is on the 10th syllable, the second to last of the verse. So these are a few technical things to think about as we're reading Dante and talking about Dante. Some more information that might be pertinent for a refresh. This is just a quick sketch of the geography of Inferno, about which we'll be talking in a few minutes. The first two canti, as I mentioned, the first canto is kind of a prologue. That's why Inferno contains 34 canti and not 33 as Purgatory and Paradise will contain. The first canto is the introductory prologue canto. Dante finds himself in the selva oscura, the dark wood. In the second, we continue talking to Dante's guide, Virgil, and we have Dante's invocation of the muses, something you might find typically at the very beginning if there weren't a canto of prologue. Canto 3 is the famous entrance to the ante-inferno, sort of pre-inferno, the gate of hell, above which we see written, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here," that proverbial phrase that has entered colloquial language. And then as we proceed throughout the Inferno, we have the 9 circles of hell, each of which contain certain sins that have been assigned, sometimes by Dante and sometimes by popular culture or antecedents in the church or in literature. And so we go through limbo, and then we go through lust, about which we'll talk tonight, gluttony, avarice, prodigality, wrath, heresy. We mentioned last week the simoniacs in circle 8 in Inferno 19 and 20. And then finally, in the lowest circle of hell, that is reserved for treachery and things like parenticide, those who would kill, who would murder members of their own family. And what's really beautiful about the architecture of the Divine Comedy is it's clear that Dante has some of this mapped out beforehand. For example, already in Inferno 5, Canto 5, Circle 2, where the exemplary sinners are Francesca and Paolo, those guilty of lust, Francesca talks about how her husband, who ends up killing her and Paolo, who is his brother, how he will end up in Circle 9, in the lowest circle of hell, reserved for those who kill a family member. And so Dante has a lot of this mapped out beforehand, even if he's writing basically while on the move. And so it's an incredible feature of the Divine Comedy that one man could have written this, and that one man could have written this and come up with an architecture so intricate while going as a beggar from place to place up and down the Italian peninsula. It's really something around which I have not been able to wrap my mind, even though I've been studying Dante for quite a while. So that's sort of where we are. We have Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradise. Inferno is divided into these 34 canti. By the way, a canto is more or less the length of a long poem. So in Dante's time, there were basically 3 genres of poems. And of course, there were subgenres and sub-subgenres. But you could either write ballata, more of a ballad that would be set to music. This was very rare. You could write a sonnet, which was typically 14 lines and would become standardized later on as 14 lines, or you could write what was called a canzone, which was a long form poem, typically around 100 verses. And so each of the canti in Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradise is more or less the length of a long poem, about 120 to 140 verses. And you can even hear in the terminology that I'm using, canto and canzone, the oral beginnings, the oral origins of poetry as something that was transmitted not by the written word. And in the Italian, whether it's sonnet, canto, canzone, those origins are betrayed by the vocabulary that we use to talk about it. All right. So that's where we are here. We're going to take about 20 minutes or so here to explore the beginning of Inferno and to talk a little bit about the beginning of Inferno and get our hands in the pasta, as we say in Italian, after which we'll have time for some discussion, I promise. One thing we should understand about Dante in the Inferno, but throughout the Commedia, is something that T.S. Eliot said in a speech that then became a small essay that he first gave in 1950 called What Dante Means to Me. And he writes, no verse seems to demand greater literalness in translation than Dante's, because no poet convinces one more completely that the word he had used is the word he wanted, and that no other will do. That is, Dante obsessed over every single word of the Divine Comedy. Every word has meaning. As he writes in Inferno 32, he makes an invocation and a sort of metapoetic declaration and saying, and I quote, "May those ladies who aided Amphion to build the walls of Thebes now aid my verse, that the telling be no different from the fact." So he wants his poetry to be accord with the content, that is, form and content should be perfectly dovetailed. And this is the longer passage from the beginning of Inferno 32 that I just quoted, but it's worth stopping on for a moment, because again, it's important to understand that even when he uses inappropriate language in Inferno, it's meant to evoke the particular context of Inferno. And so he claims in Inferno 32 that had I the crude and scrannel rhymes to suit the melancholy whole upon which all the other circling crags converge and rest, the juice of my conception would be pressed more fully. But because I feel their lack, I bring myself to speak, yet speak in fear, for it is not a task to take in jest, to show the base of all the universe, nor for a tongue that cries out mama and papa. And then he continues with the sort of invocation here. So the point is, every word is carefully studied. There have been entire books written about single words in the Divine Comedy that speaks to our obsession with Dante, but also to Dante's obsession with the written word and to making sure that the words he uses respect the content, respect the facts that he narrates. One other aspect, one other feature of the architecture of the Divine Comedy, and I alluded to this also last week, is the appearance of common themes in vertical canti, that is, in same numbered canti, in Inferno 2, Purgatory 2, Paradise 2. This also speaks to Dante's farsightedness, that is, his ability to see in front of where he was writing. Again, despite being this guy without a home, without a bed, without a desk, without a library. One of the remarkable things is the way that we can see similar things happening in different parts of the Divine Comedy. So for example, we see in Inferno, in Purgatory, and in Paradise, the same rhyme used in the same number canti, Inferno 10, and later in Purgatory 10 and Paradise 10. And it's the only place he uses parte and arte, that is partisanship or part and art. So Dante is very attentive to this. And so in part, I'm also saying to you, unless you read this in the Italian, you're really not going to get it. So you all have to study Italian as well. You thought you just had to read Dante and study Dante. All right, so we're back to the abyss of crimes punished and the sinners in the Inferno. We're in Inferno 1. Dante has lost his way. He encounters the three beasts. He meets Virgil. You'll remember that the Inferno opens up, the entire epic opens up. Midway in the journey of our life, I came to myself in a dark wood, for the straight way was lost. And much has been said about the remarkable beginning here. We're beginning in medias res, in the middle of things, not at the end, not at the beginning, but right in the middle, literally midway, nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita. Dante also here, and this has been commented on from the very beginning, uses a remarkable feature here to unite the particular, his own experience, with the reader by saying our life, and I came to myself, I was lost. And so immediately we as readers, even though we are not the I, whether the narrative I or the poet I, the character I, Dante, we begin to identify with Dante who has lost his way. In Inferno 2, Dante is still uncertain and fearful. At the end of Inferno 1, he has met Virgil, who will be his guide. Virgil has to calm his fears. And Virgil introduces Beatrice or Beatrice to Dante by recounting his own encounter with Beatrice. And we'll see a little bit of this in just a moment. After Virgil's encouraging words, and after Beatrice's encouraging words relayed by Virgil, Dante's hope is renewed. In Inferno 3, which is the infamous gate of hell, we see the first shades, the first sinners. They're the neutrals. They are those who were unable to choose in life. So if you're unable to choose something, if you stay neutral, I don't know, like Switzerland or something, you'd find yourself in this first circle, or actually zero circle. It's not even the first circle, it's the anti-inferno. It's really funny because this Inferno 3 and the shades that are guilty of being neutral has been misinterpreted and misquoted in lots of places, including in the United States Congress, where it's been a part of multiple speeches on the part of senators railing against maintaining neutrality in the face of injustice, and in Dan Brown's execrable book, The Da Vinci Code and the Inferno, where he misquotes the same sort of comment on neutrality. But that's the beginning, the first shades, the zero circle of hell is in Inferno 3, where we meet the neutrals. And then Inferno 4 includes those in limbo, where Virgil was present before he came to meet Dante. That's the first circle. And Inferno 5, which we'll touch on briefly if we have time, is the second circle of hell, those guilty of lust, where Dante meets Minos, who is responsible for sending the sinners to their particular circle, and also the ancient shades guilty of lust, Semiramis, Dido, Cleopatra, and the modern shades, two that I already mentioned, Francesca and Paolo. So, how does Dante describe sinners and hell? This is just a small sample from these first three canti from Inferno 1, Inferno 2, and Inferno 3. In Inferno 1, hell is described as the loco eterno, ove udirai le disperate strida e vedrai gli antichi spiriti dolenti che alla seconda morte ciascuna grida. These are the words of Virgil to Dante describing what he will see. He says, I'll take you through an eternal place where you shall hear despairing cries and see those ancient souls in pain as they bewail their second death, that is their universal judgment. And hell is eternal, and we'll see in just a few moments that in the first three canti, Dante refers to hell as the eternal place about 10 times, not because we will go on to eternal life, but because we will be sempiternal, we will be always punished in that place. There will be no end to our misery. Another description of the sinners comes through in Dante's response to Virgil. Poeta, io ti richeggio, che tu mi meni là dove or dicesti, sì che io veggio la porta di San Pietro e coloro cui tu fai cotanti mesti. So the sinners in Inferno are described as sorrowful. They're not happy. And you remember Dante wants to bring people from unhappiness to happiness. When Virgil in Inferno 2 is talking to Beatrice, or at least recounting his conversation with Beatrice to his new charge, Dante, he said, or had said to Beatrice, aren't you afraid of going down in this center from the wide place? So the center of the earth is hell. And we're all familiar with the popular depiction of the upside down cone of Dante's hell, most famously by Botticelli and other authors. At the end of Inferno 2, Dante says, entrai per lo cammino alto e silvestro. I entered on the deep and savage way. This description of silvestro, savage, recalls his very description of hell in Inferno 1, which he calls selvaggio, right? So we have this great specularity happening in the comedy as he describes hell and the sinners of hell. What are some other quick descriptions he gives of hell? It is the città dolente in Inferno 3, the city of woe. It is the city of eternal pain, eterno dolore, as we've already seen. It is the city of the perduta gente, the wayward or lost people. And this is how Dante begins that very beautiful Inferno 3 with the anaphora, per me si va, through me one goes. He describes the sinners of hell as le genti dolorose, miserable sinners. L'anime triste, wretched souls. Misericordia e giustizia li sdegna. Both mercy and justice hold them, sinners, in contempt. He calls them sciagurati, wretches. And the infernal boatman, Sharon or Caronte, calls them anime prave, wicked souls. So it's best not to be a sinner in Dante's Divine Comedy. You'll have arrayed against you mercy and justice. You'll be lost. You'll be woeful, miserable, wretched, and wicked. There's nothing good about being found in the Inferno. So what happens in Inferno 1 and 2? As I said, Dante begins by describing things in media res, in the middle of things. He meets Virgil, and very beautifully, Dante's first words to Virgil are actually in Latin, miserere me, please have mercy on me, citing the 50th Psalm. At the end of Inferno, after Dante has already met the three beasts, which may represent lust, avarice, and pride, or many other things, fraud, violence, and so on, Virgil says, I'm going to take you to these realms that have just been described, hell, purgatory, and paradise. It's only in Inferno 2 that Dante finally makes the invocation to the muses. He asks for their help in composing his poetry. And while he's talking to Virgil in Inferno 2, he evinces a lot of skepticism and even fear about going on to hell and purgatory and paradise. And so Virgil has to calm Dante in Inferno 2. He has to say, look, Mary called St. Lucy, who called Beatrice, and they're going to help you too. All right, so don't worry. And you'll see the passage number 2, label number 2 on this slide here, kind of jumping around a little bit between Inferno 1 and 2 here, and even 3. But in Inferno 2, this is the first time that we have a very subtle jab at Virgil. Virgil being a pagan poet, one who inhabited limbo and who could not have known Christ, is of course not going to be enough to take Dante to paradise. So he'll have to go away at a certain point. And it will be Beatrice and then St. Bernard finally, who will take Dante to the beatific vision. But in Inferno 2 already, we have this shot at Virgil through Beatrice, who says, and I quote, "I am made such by God's grace that your affliction, Virgil, does not touch, nor can these fires assail me." So this is in response to Virgil saying, aren't you afraid to go down here or go down to hell or be in purgatory when you're up there already? And she says, well, no, I've got God's grace and you don't because you're a pagan. All right. But in this same canto in Inferno 2, Dante continues to express his fear about taking a trip. And he says, and this is number 4, "Io non Enea, io non Paolo sono." I am not Aeneas, nor am I Paul. And in this one verse, number 1, we see the beauty of the Italian. If you'll notice in the Italian, the verb is actually at the very end. It's the rhyme word. And that's a very wonky word order. Normally it goes subject, verb, object, complement, sort of like English. So if we were writing this in prose today, we would just say, "Io non sono Enea, io non sono Paolo." I am not Aeneas, I'm not Paul. But Dante, in his typical beautiful poetic rendering, where he's taking this sort of cue from Latin where you postpone the verb, has a very pregnant, very grave and important sense word order here. Not only that, he unites 2 of the themes of Inferno 2, and that's the 2 influences on his epic poem. Virgil and his Aeneid, of course, Aeneas being the great protagonist of the Aeneid, and his use of scripture and his desire to sort of Christianize epic. And Dante here is really using false humility. He knows he's going to take this trip, and he actually thinks he could be like Aeneas and Paul. But he says to Virgil, I'm not Aeneas. Aeneas who went down into the underworld in the Aeneid, and I'm not Paul, who may have also taken a trip, depending on how you interpret it, down into hell, right? And so along with that, earlier on, and this is quote number 5 here, again, jumping around a little bit, but mainly staying in Inferno 2, with the Aeneas and Paul sort of coupling, Dante tries to connect Aeneas's founding of Rome with the successive founding of Rome as the seat of Christianity and of the church. That is, Aeneas founds not just Rome, but he founds Holy Rome and her dominion, verse 21, which prepared the papal mantle, verse 27 of Inferno 2. So after this beginning sort of encounter with Virgil in Inferno 1, and after some initial doubts in Inferno 2, which are then sort of calmed by Beatrice and Virgil, Dante here is really showing his cards. He wants to Christianize the sort of Latin pagan epic, and he wants to show us that his models, and really literary models in a certain sense, are scripture and Virgil. Of course, there are many others, but we have this coupling throughout, especially in Inferno 2. So at the end of Inferno 2, before Dante enters Inferno, the Ante-Inferno, and then Inferno proper, Virgil finally says to him, and this is quote number 7, "What are you waiting for? Why do you delay? Why do you let such cowardice rule your heart? Why are you not more spirited and sure when 3 such blessed ladies care for you in heaven's court?" Again, that's a reference to Mary, Lucy, and then either Rachel or Beatrice. And so at a certain point here at the end of Inferno 2, Dante says, you're right. And he says, all right, I'm going to get up the courage and we're going to go through hell. And that's where we end up in Inferno 3. Inferno 3 opens with Per me si va, the city of woe, the miserable sinners, the wayward people. And that's where Dante begins his journey. in Inferno 3, Dante is distinguished from the sinners. So in Inferno 3, which again is the anti-inferno, where we have the neutrals, those who were neither rebellious nor faithful to God, Dante is already given a different mission. So these are the words, and I already quoted them in a description of the sinners, that Caronte, the infernal boatman who ferries them across the river to hell proper. This is the description he gives to them. He says, "Woe unto you, you wicked souls! Give up all hope of ever seeing heaven. I come to take you to the other shore, into eternal darkness, into heat and chill." That's how he just speaks to the sinners. To Dante instead, and this is a beautiful part of the Commedia, because throughout Inferno, people are saying, well, wait a minute, something is wrong with you, Dante. You have a body and you look like you're alive, and I don't know, what are you doing here? And so Caronte says to Dante, after turning to the sinners in the immediate tercet, "And you there, living soul, move aside from these now dead. By another way, another port, not here, you'll come to shore and cross. A lighter ship must carry you." And so this is again a preview of Dante's special mission, of how he's differentiated from the souls, the shades, the sinners of Inferno, and how he will eventually be taking a ship, and this is the metaphor at the beginning of Purgatory, a ship to better waters, the better waters, the purgatorial waters, and then eventually to paradise. So what I mean to point out here again in Inferno 3 is how even if Dante was writing, let's say, 5 canti at a time and sort of distributing them, he had this whole thing mapped out somewhere, somehow, in a sort of ingenious architecture. And he's already being singled out here as different. We just have maybe a few minutes to touch on the final canto that I wanted to briefly introduce tonight, and that's Inferno 5. So we've talked a little bit about how Inferno 1, all right, Dante meets Virgil. Virgil's going to be his guide. In Inferno 2, Dante's fearful. Virgil allays some of those fears by saying, look, Beatrice is going to help you. All right, don't be afraid. Inferno 3, they finally enter the anti-inferno. In Inferno 4, they enter Inferno that is hell proper. The first circle, limbo. The second circle then is the circle of lust, and we're in Inferno 5. This, by the way, is perhaps the most famous canto in all of the Divine Comedy, mainly due to the British Romantics. So in the 19th century, this was like a how-to model of how to love, right? Because it was all about love and abandoning one's self to this inebriating sort of quality of love. Dante doesn't mean it quite like that. For Dante, it's a cautionary tale. You're not supposed to give in to lust. You're not supposed to give in to lust with your brother-in-law, absolutely, as Francesca will later on with Paolo. But the English Romantics and others in the 19th century absolutely love this. And of course, it's given rise to a piece by Rachmaninoff. It's given rise to an entire opera. When in the 19th century, there were theatrical spectacles of the Divine Comedy, and whenever they presented it in London, it would always be Inferno 5. Right? This was the most titillating canto. And it's true, a lot of modern people identify with this. And that's in part because we read how Dante himself, Dante the character, identifies with the sin of lust here, the sin of lust committed by Francesca and Paolo. Dante character says time and again, I had pity for them, or I took pity on them, and I almost fainted, right? So we're in the circle of lust, where the sin of lust is punished. And I mentioned before how Dante likes to find this sort of relationship between form and content. And if we think about it, it's a beautiful way to unite grammar and the actual facts narrated, because if we think about it, these sinners here are guilty of lust, which is when you sort of give into your passions, or we might say when you are passive in the face of a sort of carnal desire or the desire of profane love and not sacred love. Well, when Dante first meets the exemplary sinners in Inferno 5, especially Francesca and Paolo, they are brought to him by passive verbs. They are not active verbs. And the English says, summoned by desire, borne by their will to the sweet nest. So there aren't active verbs, but passive verbs. It's a really subtle way that Dante says, look, this form is going to reflect the content. So in Inferno 5, Dante first hears illustrious names of old, including Semiramis and others, Dido, Cleopatra, who committed this same sin of lust. Then finally, he meets two different shades about 2/3 of the way through Canto Inferno 5. And these shades are Francesca and Paolo, but only Francesca speaks. And she talks about how love left us no choice. And this is really from Andreas Capellanus's ideal of love in the Middle Ages, that love leaves you no escape. And in the fourth verse here, we have amor que nullo amato amar perdona. That is, love to no beloved does it pardon to love. That is, if you are loved, you have to love back, right? And so Francesca goes on to recount how one day she and her brother-in-law Paolo were reading Arthurian romance. They were reading about Lancelot and Guinevere. And when Lancelot and Guinevere began to get together, they too looked at each other and kissed. They gave in to this love, this profane love. Francesca happened to be married to Paolo's brother, Gianciotto. And so that's recounted here. But what's really remarkable is how Francesca does not take responsibility for her sin. If you notice here in the Italian, it's amor, amor, amor. There's another wonderful anaphora, the repetition here, just like we had an anaphora at the beginning of Inferno 3, per me si va, per me si va. It's not Francesca and Paolo that gave into this, it's love that made them do this, right? And Dante character sort of says, there but for the grace of God go I. He, knowing he's had this experience with love lyric, love poetry, says perhaps the dangers in reading poetry about love is that it could stimulate actual sin, as it did with Francesca and Paolo. And in fact, Dante responds to them, oh, how many sweet thoughts, what great desire have brought them to this woeful pass. Then I turned to them again to speak, and I began, Francesca, your torments make me weep for grief and pity. Later on, as Francesca is finishing her discourse, we also read, while the one spirit said this, the other wept. That's Paolo who's crying. So that for pity, I swooned as if in death, and down I fell as a dead body falls. This is Dante, the character in Inferno 5. So at this point, we may think that Dante, the poet, or Dante, the character, perhaps, is almost condoning this sort of sin, or at least recognizing, again, that it's easy to fall into this sin of lust. He takes pity on them, so that for pity, I swooned as if in death. So I think that takes us already to about 55 minutes here. There's more to be said, but I wanted to at least give a brief introduction to this beginning part of the Inferno. I wanted to touch on some of the ways that Dante describes sin, sinners, and the actual place of hell. And I wanted to introduce you to some of these exemplary sinners, not just the neutrals of Inferno 5, but especially Francesca and Paolo, who are impressed into the broader cultural memory, even 700 years ago, as I mentioned, in opera, in theater, in piano music, and in other poems. Right, there have been many poems written about Francesca and Paolo. And so I think I'll end my sort of presentational portion here and leave 20 minutes or so for some discussion if there are questions regarding the structure of the Commedia, the structure of Inferno, these initial sinners of Inferno, and we'll see where it takes us.
All right. Thank you, Professor. I have just given everyone the permission to unmute yourself. Please only unmute yourself when you're ready to ask a question. You can use the raise hand feature, which you can find in the bottom toolbar under reactions. Or you can also type in the chat box. Joe Donahoe, you mentioned something. Do you want to speak up, Joe Donahoe?
Yeah. Hold on. Yeah, I read that, one interpretation of the story of Francesco and Paolo is that, it's not so much against lust, or that Dante wasn't so much against, physical attraction, but when you turn your reason, God-given reason, you reject that for the passion.
Yeah.
Because without the lust, the human race doesn't perpetuate itself. So that's a good thing, but the context was very stupid.
No, absolutely. So the question of Dante's position, and then Dante, the character's position vis-a-vis lust, is one that's been discussed and debated for centuries. But there is a relevant verse that goes to what you're saying, Joe, and that is those that sottomettono ragione al talento, that make reason subservient to lust. Right, I think that's verse, I don't remember what it is, 68 or something like that, of Inferno 5. So it's part and parcel of the commission of the sin of lust is loss of reason, absolutely.
Because Dante,
I don't think the two could be separated.
Because I think Dante was invoking the Aristotelian idea that what sets man or humanity apart from the animal is the rational component, which to Dante was something that came from God.
Yes.
And if you don't use your brain, then that is the sin. And in the case of Francisco and Paolo, I think the ultimate punishment there is once they're in hell, they realize they don't love each other.
Yeah. I mean, there are of course, many problems, and they also realize, or at least they have foreknowledge of what's going to happen. John Ciotto, Francesca says, Kaina, that is the final circle of hell, the lowest circle of hell, is reserved for he who will extinguish us from this life. That is her husband, John Ciotto. Of course, the question of reason being related to lust is interesting because later on in Paradise, there's a sort of revision of that, in that Beatrice will say to Dante, reason has short wings. So it's not even enough to have reason, but we will need theology, of course, later on in Paradise, where we need even a higher sort of calling and discipline. But in Inferno 5, in the second circle here, I still think that obviously Dante puts them in hell, right? So I mean, he thinks they've sinned. Perhaps we can intuit that from the position of lust in the second circle, that it is not one of the more grave sins, right? And Dante, the character, at least, if not Dante the poet, comes close to, if not condoning, certainly understanding the temptation that can come, and that perhaps can be caused by reading literature. That's another interpretation of this sin here.
All right, Susan Hart, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. I lost track when we got to circle 6 about what they represented. And it's also hard to follow in the reading because it doesn't always announce this circle like 5.
Dante doesn't always say, hey, right, this is what we're talking about here.
No, I've got all the way up to 11, but I don't lost track with the circles and what they represent. So 6 is
Yeah, so let me put it up here for you again, maybe.
Oh, good.
And these are, and this includes most of them. Let's see here. And I'll send this PowerPoint. I'll make this available too. But I mean, this is widely available, of course, on the web and in various editions. Oh, there we are.
And then Christopher Nantista, would you like to ask your question?
Excuse my unfamiliarity with the work, but aside from the souls of the dead, does Dante make use of demons and angels as characters?
Yeah, so the most famous sort of demon-like characters will be later on in the Inferno with Malacoda and the Malabolge later on in the Inferno. But he certainly does, yeah.
But not Satan himself?
Yes, also Satan
Oh.
himself, yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Marlena Hinkle, would you like to ask your question? Marlena?
Hi, yeah, I can ask my question. So, yeah, I love the vertical reading of the cantos of the same number. And I remember in a course I took on Dante that some of these vertical cantos contain a similar theme, like politics, for instance.
Absolutely. Yeah, the number 6, right? So Inferno 6, Purgatory 6, Paradise 6, yeah.
Right. Yeah. So that was basically my question of like if you could explain some of those vertical themes, and then the number,
Yeah.
I remember the number associated with it was important, as Dante, of course, loves
Yeah.
numerology.
Yeah. So yeah, I think the numerology sometimes, even with the Canti, the number of the co-numerary Canti, is important. If you look, I mentioned that Dante likely begins his trip in the Divine Comedy on March 25th of the Jubilee year of 1300. And if you look at the Canti numbered 25 in Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradise, we have numerous associations with the number of 25 that come out in those Canti. Everything from the beginning of new life to the typical medieval understanding of the stages of man. Each age was 25 years. Of course, Christ's birth, and many other things. So numerology was important. Sometimes I think we read too much, perhaps too much into it. But there's certainly no doubt that the numbers 3, 6, 9, 25 were very important for Dante and for his contemporaries. You mentioned, and I mentioned the numbers. The most common sort of association made between and among the canticles is the number 6, right? So in Inferno 6, in Purgatory 6, in Paradise 6, the theme, of course, there's the theme of gluttony with Chaco in Inferno 6, but the broader sort of theme and the sort of gist of each of these Canti is politics. And Inferno 6, and the theme of politics sort of tracks the progress of the Commedia as a whole. So the theme of politics in Inferno deals with Florentine politics, right? The theme of politics in Purgatory 6 deals with broader politics on the Italian peninsula. So the question of who should rule, Caesar or the Pope, what sort of enslavement Italy finds itself in. And that's, of course, in Purgatory 6, where Dante and Virgil meet Sordello, and Sordello's like, hey, I'm from Mantova as well. And Virgil's like, hey, I'm from Mantova, cool. And then, of course, in Paradise 6, we have Dante's discussion of empire. And I think I mentioned it in a brief aside last week that Paradise 6, of course, is given over almost entirely to Justinian. And so Dante's genius is not just in linking these co-numerary Canti, but also having this sort of stepped content and theme that reflects the general progress of the Commedia, from blasphemy and nasty speech in Inferno to polyphonic unity and music in Paradise, from the sort of fractured, divisive, divided Florence to the real or imagined unity of the empire in Paradise 6. And Dante was a genius here. And there's actually, if anybody's interested in the vertical readings, there's a series of 3 volumes that are called Vertical Readings in Dante's Divine Comedy. And they're open access. They're available on the web. They're edited by George Corbett and Heather Webb, who are in the UK and wonderful Dante scholars. And there is a chapter on each conumerary number, so 1 through 33, with some debate about whether number 1 should go with number 1, because number 1 in Inferno is considered a prologue, or sort of introductory canto. But regardless, if you're interested in pursuing it, you can have access to those 3 volumes. It might be through like open book publishers or something, but if you just Google Vertical Readings in Dante's Divine Comedy, you'll find all 3 volumes, and they make for really fascinating reading. And they also caution that sometimes we look too hard for connections between and among the canticles, and we try to find things that aren't there, or we do find things that aren't really there. But there's no doubt Dante is intentional with what he's doing, with individual rhyme words, with themes, with the repetition of certain vocabularies throughout the comedy.
All right. Daniela, would you like to ask your question?
Yes.
Is this
hi.
about Naples again? I hope it's not
Yes,
about Naples.
it's not about Naples. Although I have to say that I'm sure you know that the major university in Naples is Federico II, which is and that it's not by
And of
accident.
course, one of the earliest commentators. Well, I mean, all right, third quarter of the 14th century is Guglielmo Mauro, who is
Yes.
a very famous commentator on the Divine Comedy. So
Yes.
there's a connection there. But
Anyhow, one is a question. When you talked about the neutrals, is that the ignavi? Because I studied this in Italian. So the ignavi are the ones who are considered, because I don't see that in the English translation anywhere. I think that's which is a sin, right?
So absolutely. And of course, this is where we perhaps have a reference to Celestine V. So if we look in Inferno 3, the actual description is, of course, about those who were neither rebellious. So, mischiate sono quel cattivo coro degli angeli che non furono ribelli né fur fedeli a Dio, ma per sé fuoro. Right? So they've thought only of themselves. And then the exemplary sinner for the neutrals is colui che fece il gran rifiuto, right? He who made the great refusal, which there is some debate about it, but it's for centuries, and by most, it's been considered to be a reference to Celestine V. I recounted that anecdote last week about Boniface VIII whispering through the wall to Celestine V, telling him, yes, you should abdicate. And so he's likely mentioned here as the exemplary sinner of the so-called neutrals.
Some people think that today l'ignavia, being neutral, is a sin.
Okay. Right.
And the second comment or question is the way that I was taught is that Francesca and Paolo represent the passionate lust, of course, love, which is that's the reason why they are in the Inferno, while Beatrice represents the l'amore angelicato. Which differentiates Dante from a lot from Boccaccio, Petrarca, and so on. Right? What is your...
absolutely. So, I mean, look, even though we have to look past the fact that Dante was not married to Beatrice, but this is Dante, the character, of course. And so, with Beatrice, she represents agape. She represents, good, sacred Christian love. And she is, in many respects, the other side of the coin with respect to a Francesca, for example. And she is so good that she has to remind Dante that he should not be fixated even on her. And so later on, for example, in Paradise 2, I believe, Dante is too focused on Beatrice, and she says, look, your gaze should not be fixated on me, but should be tied to the ultimate object of our love, which is God himself. And so she is so good that she's willing to sort of almost annihilate herself and remove herself in the context of Dante, the character's love for her.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Yeah, grazie a te.
All right, Elizabeth Mirsky, would you like to ask your question, Elizabeth?
Yeah, thank you. Professor, you said that members of Congress and others have misquoted this part about the angels in the canticle. And I was wondering if you could speak to their misinterpretation and how, people now or historically maybe have deviated from, what Dante is really trying to say about these people, damned at the gate of hell.
Yeah. So I'm trying to remember specific senators and politicians who have done this. I think one is Harry Reid, and another one might be JFK himself in a speech that he gave President Kennedy at one point. Basically, the quote that they found somewhere is that the absolute greatest sin is to remain neutral in times of trouble, or something like that. And if you look through like the congressional record, I think you can find Harry Reid saying this, and probably look up JFK's speeches. And there are even a few more. And then there's Dan Brown, who in the preface to either the Da Vinci Code or his even worse book, The Inferno, quotes the same. And I don't know where they found it, but it's not a grave misinterpretation, but it's certainly, being that it's in the sort of zero circle of Inferno, it's obviously, if we think of the hierarchy of sin here as getting more and more severe, it's obviously not that severe of a sin according to Dante's geography here in the Inferno. So the misquote is not even something Dante said at all or wrote at all. And it's perhaps not so far afield in that remaining neutral is a sin, but they came up with something somewhere. Somebody began this chain where they say to remain neutral in times of trouble or war or strife, I believe, is the greatest sin or something along those lines. So I'd have to look it up, or you could look it up. But if you look up Dan Brown and something like that, or even Harry Reid or President Kennedy, you'll find something along those lines.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, we probably have time for at least one more if there are others.
In the chat, Joe Donahoe put on something. I don't know if that's a simple clarification, if you want to see that. Joe, are you still here?
Yeah, what was the 3-line verse? You said there's 4-line verses in English usually, but
The terzina. Yeah.
Terzina. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So the terzina, here's the slide again. The terzina is the stanza that Dante uses. And was also, as I mentioned, kind of a very ingenious way of protecting his poetry, right? Because it has that sort of cascading effect, and it interlinks every successive tercet with the preceding one. And Dante was very concerned about this. I don't think I mentioned this last week, but in the Convivio, which again is a prose work that he writes, it's often called his philosophical treatise, he actually says that if vernacular language could choose for itself the best vehicle for its protection and propagation into the future, it would choose verse because it's easier to protect. So prose, since there's no rhyme and there's no meter and these sorts of things, you can do whatever you want. You can change names, you could change people, places, dates, whatever. But if you really want to make sure that language continues to exist and that it is not altered, then you should use verse. And he puts that into practice here with his terza rima because of this interlocking feature of the second verse providing the first and third rhyme word of the next terzina, right? And so, yeah, that's the terzina.
Great. Thank you. Any other questions? Would you like to tell us what to read for next week?
I would. I think we'll do one more lesson on the Inferno. And I would like to look at some of the sort of more titillating canti, especially Inferno 26, which is the canto of Ulysses, that is of Odysseus, and the final three canti of the Inferno, so 32, 33, 34. So I think most of the lesson will concentrate on Inferno 26, and then 32, 33, 34. And again, we talked about editions and things like that. You can access the Hollander through the Princeton Dante project online if you don't have access to the actual physical book. You can access the Longfellow with the Dartmouth Dante Lab Reader, and you can access the Mandelbaum with the Digital Dante project of Columbia University and Teodolinda Barolini. So you have access to some of the more reputable English translations, even online. So the Hollander's Princeton Dante project, the Longfellow is the Dartmouth Dante Lab Reader, and the Mandelbaum is the Digital Dante project at Columbia.
Are those the three links that you
They
shared
are,
in the email?
yeah, yeah.
Great. So those three links are up on the classroom webpage. So if you go to the classroom archive, they are there and they're links. So you just click on them and it'll take you straight to the
Excellent.
pages. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. Let's just close with a quick glory be. But thank you, Dr. Nussmeier.
Thank you.
We thank you, Lord, for bringing us together. Continue to help us to study, open our hearts and minds. So through these classical works, we can draw closer to you. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. All right. Thank you all, and good night.
We'll see y'all next week. Alla prossima.